Hello, everybody.
Hi, everybody. This is Brendan Baylott from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. Sorry about the slight delay there. We had a little bit of technical excitement, but nothing we couldn't solve with a little bit of fortuity. So, thank you, everybody, for coming back. Thanks to those who joined the Zoom room over lunch. It was a lot of fun. Pretty cool to get a lot of people together who don't normally get to see each other from all over the Great Lakes. So, tremendous fun. I want to get going really quick because we lost a little bit of time there, and I know Wes has an excellent program. I'm really excited to hear it. So, ladies and gentlemen, Wes Oleszewski is a published author with over 30 books. He's one of our kind of most senior researchers on the Great Lakes. And Wes, thanks again for doing this.
Okay, well, I hate to be tardy. I'm an airline pilot by nature, and so let's just get rolling here.
Excellent.
Okay, we're cleared for takeoff. We're going to talk today about James Davidson's White Oak Graveyard. James Davidson built more than 100 vessels, all out of wood. Maritime jargon is graveyard means a place where lake boats go when they're no longer used, when they're abandoned. They go there to die. So we're going to look at some of his yard from 1880 to 1902. And we're going to run right through it here. If there's a lot of words and I'm going too fast for you to read them, don't worry about it. I talk fast. Okay, where is the yard located? It's located right in Bay City, Michigan. Downtown Bay City, believe it or not, on the west side. He made vessels that were over 300 feet in length. And that was a conventional stopping point. Was 300 feet, primarily because you needed so much wood to reinforce larger hulls that you couldn't carry enough cargo to be profitable. Somehow he broke the 300-foot length. Now his yard was conveniently located right there on the Saginaw River, right in the middle of Lumber Central. And one thing that is really important to look at as we go through these slides is the railroad links that went in to where his vessels were created. Here, once again, you see the railroad links, and you see 1, 2, 3 vessels being built at the same time. That's the way he mass-produced these boats. Here you see 2. We think these are the Amazonas and the Orinoco. This photograph was taken in 1898. He also had a really nice dry dock. As a matter of fact, it was the best dry dock for wooden ships on the Great Lakes at the time. The dry dock still exists. In this photograph that was taken by my lake boat buddy, DJ Story, thanks DJ, a river walk has been made over the old shipyard. The gate to the dry dock is gone, but there's a nice bridge that goes over it. And people stroll by here and really have no idea what it was once used for. The yard built vessels that were so huge that it took 50 acres of wood to make one of these vessels. Now, this is the Chieftain from 1902. Her and the Montezuma were the last 2 vessels made in the Davidson yard. These vessels were both more than 350 feet long. Now, if you take a good look, this is his dry dock. This is one of his big steamers. The yard worked until about 1929 with the onset of the Great Depression. And then Davidson's vessels came home to roost. Notice here, this is the yard right after the onset of the Depression. James Davidson died just as the Depression was onsetting. So his vessels were brought back to the yard. It was still active at the time. There were 2 steel steamers, the Cottonwood and the Lake George, that were also parked there. They were later taken away for saltwater use. But in 1934, this is what the yard looked like, with the steamer Sacramento, the Grampian, the Montezuma in the background here, and the MATANZAS right there. Taking a look here, this is the yard seen in the 1950s. Notice that most of the vessels that you'd seen parked there have been burned. There's only 3 that have not been torched yet: the Montezuma, the Sacramento, and the Grampian. Here we see them after the arsonist got to all the vessels. there are two flat barges here, and there's a tug right there. Right here is the Montezuma. This is the Shenandoah. And out of view here is the Sacramento. This is the dry dock once again. And this is the Grampian and MATANZAS. So he constructed the largest wooden steamers practically in the world, but nobody knows exactly how he did it. Not to this day do we know exactly what his trick was. And by the way, in looking at this launch photo, once again, you see the rails. So according to local sources, what happened was one of the heirs of the Davidson estate ordered the last remaining employees to go to the shipwreck or ship office, take out every document, every drawing, everything, put it in a huge pile in the middle of the yard, pour kerosene on it, and burn it. Now, why would somebody do something like that? What would be the possible reason? This is our reason right here. This little article from May 14th, 1954 in the Bay City Times. In the article, it states that the city attorney's office will check to discover ownership of the vessels as a preliminary to legal action to force their removal. Some of these boats were more than 300 feet in length and still had their engines and boilers in them. It would have cost an enormous amount of money to remove those wrecks that the city deemed as eyesores. So it would be logical to conclude that if there are no records that lead to any heir to the Davidson estate that prove that they have ownership of those vessels, there's no way to compel them to remove the vessels from the property. Thus, they're gone. Now here we see a map from 1896 and where the vessels and their remains were in modern times. Today, a nice park has been made. There's a ball field and there's a river walk right here. It also goes right over top of where the dry dock is here. And the remains of most of the vessels are right there. Here's a picture from the U.S. Geological Survey that shows the yard on May 20th, 1954. Let's zoom in and get a closer look. Here we see that the Montezuma has yet to be torched, as the Sacramento has also yet to be torched. But they did get to the Grampian, and they got to the Shenandoah, and they got to the MATANZAS and the Granada. But also, if you look very closely at this picture, you can see the old railheads still exist in the picture, which is just fascinating that all of that was still there at that time. Here's another U.S. Geological Survey picture. This one's from October 29th, 1965. Now, all of the vessels have been torched. The Montezuma is here. She's torched the waterline. Sacramento is here. She's essentially torched the waterline. And right here is the dry dock. Here are the two flat barges, and here's the old tug. Low water is the only way we get to observe these wrecks today. Here's the latest. I took this from Google Earth recently. This is the most current view. You can see the beautiful park here. You can see the dry dock and its bridge, and you can see there is nothing remaining of those railheads. They're just filled in and gone forever. Somebody told me they thought that might be part of a railhead. I don't know. But if you look very closely, you can see the Shenandoah here, and you can see the MATANZAS here, and you cannot see the Granada. But where is the Montezuma? The Montezuma is actually right here. They filled in over her, but we're going to get a better look at her in a minute. First, let's look at the Grampian. The Grampian was launched in 1894, and she was built specifically for the Davidson fleet. She was 230 feet in length, 38 feet in beam, 13 feet in depth. She was abandoned in the Saginaw River in the 1930s and then towed to the Davidson yard later and parked where you see her right now. In the background here is the Sacramento. There's another view of the Grampian. They actually thought when she came to the Davidson yard, she'd do a little bit of servicing and she would go back into business in 1929. She didn't. What's really interesting in this picture, You can see they really thought she was going to sail again. All of her doors, windows, and shutters are intact, and her bell is still there. So normally when a vessel is abandoned, one of the first things that goes is the bell. It's the easiest thing to carry away. So here she is in a nice picture that was given to me by Bay City historian Don Comptos. In this one, she's abandoned now. And you can see how much detail we've got. We've got that through the magic of the computer. This original image was only 1/2 inch in size. Here she is in her final days. And you can see she's listing. She's sunken to the bottom of the mud of the river. But one interesting aspect shows here. None of the Davidson vessels were painted on their bottom. They left the wood bare because the water would soak into the wood and better seal it and make it watertight. So the water made it watertight. Here she is after the serial arsonist got to her on the night of May 11th, 1954. She's burned to the waterline, and that's where she remained. Later in the 1990s sometime, the city went in and they took her out of there with heavy equipment. In other words, backhoes and bulldozers and such. Now, the Matanzas and the Granada. Both vessels were quite long. They were two of Davidson's giants. Matanzas was the largest at 324 feet. And in 1928, both were laid up in the yard. They were the first to have been gotten to by the arsonist, and I don't have an exact date on that. This is what they look like at low water. You can see the Granada was obviously burned when the water was much lower, because by the time the water got there and quenched the fires, she sank pretty low. Here's another view. Notice in this view that you can see two interesting aspects of these boats. You can see, number one here, the vertical stanchions that held up the second deck. And down here, you can see the irons or steel straps that were used for hogging strength. And here's a view of her stern. You got to see the deadwood in here. And the really interesting aspect of this picture is the ducks. They really love these wrecks at low water. Now we see not only the Matanzas and the Granada, but we also see right here the bow of the Shenandoah. The water at this date, which is November 8th, 2000, was at a record 24 inches below normal. And that's the kind of view you get at that very low water. Next is the Sacramento, one of my favorite vessels to work with because her ending is such a shame. She was launched on the 24th day of July, 1895. Now, that year, 1895, the Davidson Yard launched 2 light draft barges, 2 giant wooden car ferry barges, the schooner Granada, and the Rappahannock and Sacramento, all in 1 year. And once again, I'll show you the rails right here that brought in the lumber that built these vessels. This is an interesting cross-section that came from marine engineering of the late 1890s. And this one supposedly shows one of the steamers, and we're not sure which one, but essentially the Sacramento, Rappahannock, and the others were built along the same lines. Let's face it, he was mass producing vessels at this time. Here's a closer look at that photograph from 1934 that shows the Sacramento in her final resting place. Note that her stack is gone, her forward mast still stands, and her cabins are intact. Here's another view from 1936. This is September 13th, 1936. And you'll notice that her cabins are intact. Her mast is standing. And people haven't gotten poor enough around there to actually scavenge her for lumber, but that's coming. In a later view, we can see here that she's been knocked down quite a bit. A lot of her inner workings have been scavenged away, but the yard is still active because the door on this shed is partially open. In other views of this taken just a few weeks later, the door is closed. So somebody's actually working in that yard at that time. This one was taken between April 18th and April 19th, 1945. So here she is between 1945 and May of 1954. And the way we can date that is if you look in the background, you will see the mast of the Grampian still standing, meaning that it's before that May date when they burned the Grampian. So here the Sacramento is in really bad condition and is essentially just a hulk. But notice here, the dry dock is still in pretty good shape. After she was burned by the serial arsonist, this is what was left. This is her steel boiler room, and it was built from steel to protect it from a fire hazard. This is her triple expansion engine. Here we see her hogging straps and a lot of her cross bracing. Now we see her here in the 1970s. And this is about the time that in 1975, when the city fathers of Bay City decided she was an eyesore and she had to go. Historians begged that they should preserve this triple expansion steam engine. They didn't. They knocked it down with a bulldozer. And Don Comtos told me that as he stood there and watched that happen, Ralph Roberts said the same thing. You could hear those legs breaking. It sounded like bones breaking. They covered her up and made her into a ball field. The Shenandoah, which is offshore there and sitting in the river, was launched on May 16th, 1894. She was 320 feet in length, 43 feet in beam, roughly standard size for a Davidson vessel. One thing to take notice of in this picture, look at the boiler here. That's one to go to another Davidson boat somewhere else in the yard. She had a relatively easy career. She didn't do anything spectacular, and she ended her days just as a working vessel towed in and laid up in the Davidson yard forever. Now, her wreck today looks like this at low water. When you go to see her, what you're going to find are some things really stand out of interest. First one is this metal things right here. And this little guy right here that looks like a fallen mast. On closer examination, these are her boilers. And if you look, these are her fire tubes right here, her furnace tubes. These are the water tubes from her boilers. This is a look at the Sacramento's boilers while she was in layup, and somebody got brave enough to walk down in that hull and actually take this picture. Here you see the furnace cylinders. Here you see the water tubes and the actual size of the boilers. Today, those furnace cylinders are pointing upward. The water tubes are right here, and there is a zigzag cut in each one of these boilers. I don't know where the cut came from. Somebody used a torch. We don't know why, if they were trying to get metal for scrap or what was going on, but they cut it up. Now, here's where the boilers were located originally. If you can see down here, the shape of a man. Imagine working in this spot, shoveling coal into that furnace. This is the only vent they had right here. Now, those boilers sat like that along with her engine. And when she burned, this is what happened. Here's the water line. The boiler sat on the middeck. When that deck burned away, the boiler tumbled down and impacted right there, and we ended up with it sticking up the way we see it today. Our next slide takes us to the mystery object that I always thought was a mast. But we got a clue when I showed Pat Labadie, the Great Lakes historian and expert on wooden vessels, this picture. And his clue was right here. What he showed me was that is a counterbalance. And a counterbalance, as you can see here, sticks out in the front of the rudder. This is the rudder from the Sacramento, one of the few things that was saved. And you can see what it does is it acts as an additional surface to make the rudder more effective and take some pressure off of her steering gear. About this much of that rudder is still submerged in the river. And to give you an idea of size, once again, we have our sailor here. It's about 27 feet. Next, we're going to look at the Montezuma. Montezuma was one of the largest wooden vessels ever constructed. She was the second largest in keel length by 1 foot. Chieftain beat her by 1 foot. Chieftain is also in the Saginaw River as a wreck, but it's not at the Davidson Yard. It was towed away for another purpose. And I don't have time to cover it in this show. But this is the Montezuma. And at low water, you can actually touch the Montezuma. Here she is, shown as a wreck, just rotting. She actually spent more or as much time practically rotting as she did sailing. She sailed for 27 years. She rotted for 25. When she was burned by the arsonist, it took her down to about here. So you can see the level that was taken away. Note here in this picture, her stanchions right there that held up her main deck. All of these wrecks that are in the river right now, including the Chieftain, have huge portions of their hulls that are still in the mud. As you get close to the site at low water and you have to step off the boardwalk and go walk along the riverbank, there's a lot of rocks and junk, but there's this stuff. This is the double hull to the Montezuma. What you're looking at is her port side. You notice the double hull, you notice the bolts, and you notice this tube. I always tell people it's just a big metal monster. I don't know what it is. Frankly, I think it is the hydraulic line for her steering mechanism. Here are her knees. Notice that she burned right down to that mid-deck and then sunk. Otherwise, this part of the knees would not be available. Also, look here, and you can see one of her steel hogging straps. Now, if you look back toward the river and toward her end from her what should be her mid-deck, you can see an interesting object right here just laying there. What is it? Zooming in, you can see this is also a piece of a rudder. This is her ice sheath to protect the rudder from ice. And when she burned, somebody either pulled this out or it rotted to the point where somebody pulled it out, and all of the wood is gone, and all you have left is the ice sheath and the steering mechanism. So, considering that she was one of the largest vessels, wooden vessels in existence and on the Great Lakes, you would think that she'd get a little bit more attention than what we have right now. Instead, she's filled with riprap stone and earth and junk and beer bottles and whatever you can find. And there she lies. And it shows how the city fathers of Bay City in the 1970s treated their maritime history. They took care of it with bulldozers. So that's a tour of the Davidson shipyard. And there were a lot of people who helped in this. I want to mention them quickly. My research buddy and photo buddy, DJ Story, the late Ralph Roberts, Pat McCarthy, who edited the writing in this, Dave Swayze, who assisted me in research, Don Comtos, and of course, the great Pat Labadie. I have to mention him. Reference staff at the Bay City Branch Library, and I have a bibliography down here. If you can read it fast enough, you're better than I am. Okay, here I am. And but I'm not getting your sound again, dude. Okay, well,
I had to unmute myself.
Oh, okay, yay! We stumbled over that sound for I don't know how long.
We did. It was tough. So, Wes, thanks so much. I
made that in 33 minutes.
With how many slides was it?
Well, actually, it came out to 68. I cut it down a bit.
It was a great talk, Wes. Really, really fascinating stuff. The biggest ships ever built, really, on the Great Lakes, and
the Great
Lakes are right there.
Yeah. Now, the Chieftain is farther up the river. In 1945, a fellow bought it for $1, is what I was told, and towed it up to the Cass Avenue, where the Cass Avenue Bridge used to be. And he scuttled her because it was easier than putting somebody on her to maintain her, because she's right there by the shipping lanes. And it was going to be a dock face. And then he never went through with that. And the arsonist got to her as well. So they just say in the Bay City newspapers, they just say it was vandals. And it's, well, I don't know. You had somebody running along that river that was getting kicks out of burning these vessels. You had a serial arsonist that was doing this. A fun story about the chieftain, since I know where she is. I was up flying for the Michigan DNR and going out on my daily passage with my little DNR guy sitting there in the cockpit with me with his counter and stuff. And I was looking down and I saw a powerboat going like crazy up the river and heading straight for the chieftain. You could see her outline in the river. But this guy apparently couldn't see it. And he was in one of those big cigarette boats and just hauling butt. And I told the DNR guy, watch this, you're going to love it. And I pointed out the outline of the chieftain and he said, he's going to hit that. And just then, pow, he hit it. And that boat came to a real stop, real fast, real expensive.
Boy, that was really something that you had access to Ralph Roberts for a lot of that material. He sounds like, and remember when you were talking about him, he was an interesting fella. Can you tell me a little bit more about Ralph, a little bit of your experience with him?
Yeah, Ralph is an interesting guy. It was Dave Swayze who pointed him out to me. We were at Sanilac at a shipwreck thing, and I think I had 3 books out at the time. And so I had a line of people that were signing, and there was this gray-haired guy walking about, and Dave Swayze says, that's him right there. That's Ralph Roberts, the collector. And I said, well, maybe you'll come talk to me. He says, he doesn't like to talk to people. And he says, you really have to be careful with him. So Ralph came up and started thumbing through my books. And he kind of grunted about this and that. And, yeah, this thing. And he said, so is this what you do? And I said, no, I'm an airline pilot. And he says, oh, who do you fly for? And I told him, and he said, well, I'm an aircraft mechanic. And I said, oh, really? He says, yeah, I do it in my spare time now that I'm retired. And so we got talking, and he said, where are you from? And I told him I'm from Saginaw. He says, well, did you ever fly out of Tri-City Airport? I said, I used to work at Tri-City Airport. I worked at Hangar 6. And he said, well, do you know Russ Purchase? I said, Russ Purchase gave me my private pilot certificate. I took my check ride with him. Oh, do you know Bill Crowler? I said, Bill Crowler taught me how to rivet. And all of a sudden, we had common ground in a different area. We had an aviation common ground, and he was much more open in those areas. So now we had 2 things going for us. And so we get into this long conversation. We knew a lot of the same people, and he had given me his phone number, and he told me, he said, don't call often. This is before we established some groundwork. When we were done talking, he just gave me a nudge. He said, you can call me as much as you want. So, and it went from that to whenever I was in Saginaw, I'd give him a call. I'd say, well, why aren't you here? I'm at home. And so I'd go to his house and we'd sit around. And the first time that I sat down with him and in his collection, and he had photos, he had to actually put an extra basement support underneath his photo bin, the shelves where he had his photos. They were 4-inch binders, black binders. And when he pulled them out, they sprung open because there was so much stuff in there that they just spring open like that. So he pulled open a binder and he pulled out, and he says, you know what this vessel is? And I said, yeah, that's the Eldest. And he said, and she had a sister. I said, yeah, the Choctaw. He says, you know what the difference was? And I said, yeah, the Choctaw had 4 pilot house windows and the Eldest had 3. And he went, and he closed the book and put it away. I said, you old fart, you just tested me, didn't you? And he went, yep. So
yeah, those guys didn't suffer fools gladly or
no.
Contact there.
Yeah, he did not like divers. And so I put him in touch with a few, and I told him what you got to do is you got to take something that he doesn't have and give it to him in tribute, and then you'll be in. And that was the way to get him. The Stayers went there and they took him one of their books and signed it for him, and all of a sudden he was okay. But if you took a friend with you, once went to take my friend DJ with me, And I said, I got this buddy here. He wants to come over with me. And he's a Great Lakes guy. And he says, well, is he a pain in the ass? And I went, well, no. And he said, then he can come.
Wes, what happened to Ralph's collection? Do you know where it ended up?
Yes, it is in very, very safe hands. I'm not going to say who's got it, but he's a good friend of mine.
So it didn't get donated to a public collection. It's in
his aircraft models, his aviation airplane models, which he had fabulous airplane models that he built, were all donated to the James Clements Airport, and they're in a cabinet there. But his vast book and picture collection is in the hands of another collector. He is keeping it in his climate-controlled basement. I've been there. And you can't tell you're in a basement. It's like you're in a vault at the New Air and Space Museum's Udvar Hazy facility. It's that climate controlled, and it's safe. And he and I are going to be working on it over the years to get things in order and see what can be digitized and what can go where and so on. So we're watching over it very carefully. He told me many, many years ago that it was going to somebody safe. And he said, someone that I trust implicitly. And now that I'm friends with this fellow, I know that, yes, you can trust this guy completely. And so it's there. It's in very safe hands. But his pictures, he had everything that anybody else has in any library, because these historical societies would call him to come out and go through their pictures and identify vessels and identify the locations and so on. And he'd say, yeah, I'll do that. I won't charge anything, but I get to copy every picture. That's the deal. And so he'd be down someplace for 3-4 weeks, and he'd copy all these pictures and put them in his private collection. So he also had some horror stories. I mean, he went and he saw up in Rogers City, and they were in a storeroom for one of the big limestone producers. And in there, they found, I think he said, 6 or 7 boxes of big 4-inch glass negatives.
Wow.
But the limestone powder in the atmosphere over the years had contaminated them to the point those were fused together. He said you couldn't get them apart with a screwdriver.
Oh, geez.
So all of that was lost just because it was just stored in a shoebox. So, you hear those stories and it just, it makes you cringe.
Too many of those kind of stories. That's one of the things that, I like to encourage people to do who have big collections, is to eventually donate them to a public archive. That's what I'm going to do with my collection. I've made arrangements for it, and I try to get people to do that. So many of us that collect, we think we're never going to die, or at least we don't like to think about it, and yeah. I'm very old, but I had to start thinking about it. What am I going to do with all this stuff? So good stories, though. Great stories.
I just had my 63rd birthday. So, you start thinking about that stuff when you get to be this age. And that's why I got to tell you about my can of paint. I had a jar. I made a model for the captain of the EM Ford. And when we were talking about making the model, I showed him another one where I had tried to mix the Huron cement off-white paint that they use on the hulls. And it was way off. And I said, well, Cap, it's really hard to mix that stuff. And he said to the first mate, he says, go on down and get Wes a couple of jars of that paint. He said, sure. And he ran down to the paint room, come back with 2 jars about yay big, and just peanut butter jars filled with that paint. And so I used most of one of the jars and put some others in, but the other jar sat on my shelf over here for the better part of 30 years. And just recently I looked at it and I went, if I croak tomorrow, Teresa's going to throw that in the trash. And it's real Huron cement off-white paint, and it came from the oldest vessel on the Great Lakes, So what I did is I opened the jar, and I had to pry the lid open, destroy the lid to get the jar open. And I doled that paint out. It was still good, absolutely good. And I doled it out into little tiny jars, and I sold a bunch of it on eBay. And I have 3 or 4 jars left. So as Ralph Roberts would say, if you're a friend of mine, I'll get you some of that.
Great story, man. Great story. Well, Wes, let's start wrapping her up, and we can give a little bit of time for our next presenter to get queued up, because as we both found out,
there can be trouble. I'm glad we took 15 minutes. You know, we blew that.
Throw you a curveball.
Yeah. So I just want to tell everybody, you really can't buy my books right now because if you buy them on Amazon, you're going to get secondhand books. The only way to get the new books is off of Avery, and they're closed because they are shut down for the pandemic. So the state of Michigan has closed their shop. My latest book is right there, 99% done, and can't go to the printer because it's stuck right there at Avery and everything's closed. But you can get your books from me. I have a stock here, and all you have to do is go to, it's very simple, authorwest.com. authorwest.com. And I'll say that, or I'll type that slowly for you. I had said that once to a guy that was an idiot. I'm typing slowly so you can understand me. Authorwest.com, and you can buy the books directly from me. I sign them right here on the table behind me. I'll autograph them, and I'll sign them to whoever you want. They go out by priority mail.
I just posted it. Authorwest.com.
There we go.
All right. Well, Wes, thanks so much for doing this, man. It was a great talk. That's a real hot topic, you know, Davidson's Goliaths there. And I happen to be looking for one of James Davidson's ships.
Yes, I know that.
The Kate Winslow.
Yes.
If not the first.
One of the reasons why he was able to do that, by the way, we kind of figured out, is the lattice of strapping that he used, the steel strapping, but also he ran steel wires in between all of that. And there are millions of bolts in each one of those vessels that go this way and that way and this way and that way through every one of the foothocks. And so that's part of his method, but we don't know exactly how it went because everything's gone.
Cool. Yeah, well, we'll see if we can find another one to add to the analysis, because it's an early ship. But anyway, we should wrap up so I can give Tammy some time to get in.
Yes.
Thanks again for doing this. Great presentation.
Thank you, sir.
As always, a pleasure to talk to you. Everybody,
well, we had a late departure and we had an early arrival. So
excellent. Well, everybody, take some time and tune in for Tammy Thompson, our state underwater archaeologist here in the fine state of Wisconsin. And Tammy's going to talk about Wisconsin shipwrecks and getting them on the National Register of Historic Places, which is something he is well qualified to talk about, as probably the person who's put more shipwrecks on the National Register than any other living person. So very excited to hear her. And of course, being from Wisconsin, I'm a little biased. So thanks again, Wes, and see you all at 2:00 Central Time. So long.